Hi, Cynthia Allen. Happy to have you here tonight for Move Better, Feel Better, the Feldenkrais Awareness Summit. And we've had this beautiful theme today of physiology meets spirituality. We had 3 talks in this track, which you may have not listened to yet. That's fine. We're gonna make it a very interesting discussion, whether you've heard them or not. But I just want to mention who those talks are. We had Larry Goldfarb on the purposeful practice, prayer, and Feldenkrais. We had Aaron Giesman-Rabke on embodiment, compassion, and ecology, a spiritually integrated approach to healing ourselves and our relationship with the world. And then we had Buffy Owens on the breath of resilience. Now here tonight with me are Maggie Burrows. Maggie comes through to Feldenkrais from modern dance and Tai Chi Chuan. She has a love of spiritual philosophy and has explored ideas of Sufism and how to combine slow movement with the Feldenkrais work or other ways of deepening one's sense of self. She started into her training with chronic anxiety problems, her Feldenkrais training with chronic anxiety problems from childhood. And then she realized that Feldenkrais was not going to just help her with that, but with every aspect of her life. She graduated with her Feldenkrais training in 1990. She's an accomplished actress, and vocalist, and we're very glad to have you here, Maggie. And then we have Josh Schreiber Shalim, and I don't think I still said that right, Josh, so you'll have to correct me in a moment. He's also a musician, or comes from that very creative track. So I've got 2 creative performing people here tonight, a Feldenkrais practitioner, and he is now a rabbinical student. He lives in Boston. Maggie, by the way, is from London, and she's here with us like at 11 o'clock at night. So we really appreciate that. Josh is like me, Eastern time, from Boston. And he came into the Feldenkrais method as an injured musician. And so he was looking at Feldenkrais, Alexander technique, Tai Chi again, on how to recover from chronic pain. And then along that way, he also really started to find the connection to his spiritual dimensions of himself. So he's connecting, reconnecting, exploring the Jewish tradition that he was born into. And he'll be able to give us, I think, a unique perspective, since Dr. Feldenkrais was Jewish, and something we don't talk about sometimes as much in the Feldenkrais work as we probably should talk about. So we're going to be able to delve into that a little bit tonight. And like Maggie, he's been exploring how to have a kind of combination of Feldenkrais method and spiritual explorations. So thank you both. Welcome. If you can unmute yourselves and say hi.
Thank you. And it's Shalem. Yeah, we're pretty close.
Hi. Hi to you. Hi to everyone.
Thank you, Maggie, for trying to figure out how to light up a room at that late at night. It's not simple, is it? I also want to say that Maggie is one of the people who's been sick with COVID-19. We're very glad that you recovered and that you're able to be here with us tonight. So
thank you.
You know, I think we had a really fruitful meeting with each other, didn't we, to sort of prepare for this. And one of the things that we talked about is it might be good to have a little bit of a spiritual biography of each of us. And let's start there with just a little snippet of how would you, in a sentence or 2, describe your spiritual biography? And either one of you. Josh, you want to start?
I'll start. I grew up secular Israeli, so like Moshe Feldenkrais in that sense, just with a very sort of anti-religious streak. I was born in the States, which is why I have an American accent. I moved back here when I was 16, and I was interested in spirituality, but of course I wouldn't look to Judaism for spirituality. I saw it as a sort of a stale, rote kind of approach to organized religion. And it wasn't until I was after college dealing with actually asking myself, how do I relate to myself? How do I relate to the world I'm in? I was teaching Hebrew school. Turned out that American suburban Reform Jews had something to teach me about spirituality. So for me, my sense of spirituality and my sense of Judaism is completely connected to an embodied awareness of myself. the texts and the prayers and the act of prayer and all of that. It's difficult for me to see it as anything but, a very fully embodied experience of living. And just as the kind of awareness that I get from the Feldenkrais method, adds an aspect of awareness of life for me. Religion and being a religiously practicing person adds a dimension to my experience of life.
Thank you. Thank you. Maggie.
Yes. Oh, it's such a big subject. Try not to get too excited right away. I was born into a Catholic family, but my mother was very highly trained theologically. She'd been to school with nuns, but she then studied with the Dominican friars. So she used to tell me that she was qualified to preach on the streets if she chose to. And it meant she had a very deep theological background and a rich understanding of the kind of Christianity that was around us. However, she also got divorced. So we were gently excommunicated from the Catholic environment, and I ended up going to schools that were much more standard English Protestant kind of focus, and then read the Gideon Bible, which we were given when we were about 11, when we first started in secondary school, and just fell in love with Jesus. Now, I already liked Jesus, but then I fell in love with Jesus, and it all seemed to me to be extraordinarily practical and logical and sensible. But some of the belief systems didn't feel that way. And so I became, I think, a fairly classic version of somebody who didn't completely reject every aspect of their religion, but stopped being somebody who called themselves a believer. And at that point, I started reading other systems, got very interested in Jung, got very interested in Taoism in particular, Sufism. So by the time I came to Feldenkrais, which I think is hugely practical approach to improving life, I just saw overlaps everywhere. It all made complete sense to me very, very quickly. And I was very comfortable with the philosophical side of it. I never for one moment thought that I was learning a movement system. I always knew I was learning a way of being, and a martial way of being, but a modified, gentler, more suitable for a new century version of what martial arts teach, this kind of whole self-awareness. So yes, it's always struck me as being very much a kind of very central to the way the world works, because it's about the brain, and the brain is very central to how the world works. So I hope that made some sense. I will try not to.
No, it made sense, and you're allowed to be excited, Maggie. Excitement is not a bad thing. Yeah, so thank you. So I was born in a Midwestern in the United States sense of it, fundamentalist Christian family. Mm-hmm. And so my father was a little bit of a renegade. My mother was actually Catholic, but had left the Catholic Church to get married. And one of the stories out of my childhood was as I was being born, the nuns being very difficult with my mother and telling her that she would go to hell if she didn't come back to the church, and my father finding them and her talking to her in that way and her crying. However, I have to say my religion that we were raised with was no better. We did think my mother was going to hell because she didn't really convert into anything else. She just kind of stayed separate for at least for most of my childhood. And, we had a lot of rules. Everything was about rules, and you in theory had grace, but there was no grace. You couldn't possibly ever fit all those rules. And so, as an adult, I continued along those lines for a while, but it got more and more uncomfortable for me. Then I had a long period where I really just completely left any kind of practice. And then I'd have to say somewhere around the time that I was discovering the Feldenkrais method, I also started exploring earth-based spirituality, other forms of spirituality. And something in the Feldenkrais method softened me or allowed me to become more receptive and forgiving, I think, of myself, and to quit fearing hell, to be honest. I mean, really, that's we really got down to it. I finally quit being scared of going to hell. And that was in my mid to late 30s when I finally quit being scared of going to hell. And so I would consider myself Christian at this point, although I would recognize that many Christians would not consider me Christian. And my Christianity is extraordinarily expansive, and I'm interested in what I consider to be the real teachings of Jesus, as opposed to maybe some of the things that we've stayed with that were less about love and acceptance. And so that's where I'm at today. And so we got a little sense of all three of us here. We really managed, right, to not talk about God in these first three presentations whatsoever, or about religion, even though the topic was physiology meets spirituality. And in our little pre-talk, Josh really encouraged me to say, hey, let's get these things out on the table. Let's be a little bit more forthright with them. So I appreciate that, Josh, and glad to do it. So I'd like to start actually with sort of the topic that was listed third on the page if people were listening to them in order, and that is the breath of resilience from Buffy Owens. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, so many creation stories begin with something related to breath. Even the Native American stories, some of those stories are around naming, and you have to have breath to name something, you know. So, and then we have the Judeo-Christian creation story, which is to breathe life in. So there's something right away about breath, isn't there, Josh? Something right away.
Yeah. First of all, I want to say a caveat to before. I think I mentioned myself as a practicing Jew before. I think there's some practicing Jews who wouldn't consider me a properly practicing Jew. After all, you can see there's still light over there, and it was a little bit of a difficult choice for me to make to actually be on this Zoom call when what's technically still Shabbat. But that aside, my practice is one of those that tries to dance between the tradition and the structures, the spiritual structures of the tradition, and living in you know, American civilization. But about breath, I remember when I was listening to the conversation you had with Buffy, you mentioned God breathing breath into Adam, and you used the Greek word, and I said, but that was a Hebrew word. There's some interesting teachings around that. So that's very explicit there, that Vayifach Adam, Vayifach Elohim, God blows life, nefesh, into Adam. And there's a Jewish tradition that's not written in the Bible. It's in what's called Midrash, which some people sometimes refer to as the fan fiction of the Torah, the rabbinic received tradition, that the way God took the nefesh back from Moses at the very end of the 5 books of the Torah is with a kiss. And I remember somebody once commenting, and I wish I could remember where this came from, that you could see this as Adam's first inhalation is God's exhalation, and Moses's last exhalation is God's inhalation. And that's just, when I heard that, I thought about that experience that I've found through Feldenkrais method of when you attend to your breath, and at some point you can attend to your breath without controlling it, and you have this experience of being breathed, right? Of being breathed, that the breath is coming and going, that each breath starts as, you know, as a moment of grace, that the breath comes, and that we're always exchanging our breath with our environment, right? And that so this idea that the breath of life is something we share with everything that's around us. And it's really interesting right now, we're doing this physical distancing from everybody because there's some of the complexity in that life that we each have that maybe we don't want to be exchanging right now. And I remember once I was teaching a Feldenkrais lesson around breath, in a Jewish context. And when I told that story, this rabbi who was there had this look of aha on her face, and I asked her afterwards about it. So she's a chaplain, and she's been present at hundreds of people's last breath, including very profoundly her husband's. And she said that that moment of experiencing that in her own breath, that the breath comes if you just wait. If everybody wants to try this, you know, people say, take a deep breath. And I prefer to say, wait for a deep breath. Let the breath go out. And then just wait for it to come in. And we have a blessing in Judaism that's part of the prayers that we say 3 times a day, of God as Mechayeh HaMetim, who gives life to the dead. And in its original source, it may have been a reference to the coming of Messiah, but it's also some reference too that our life comes by grace of this breath that comes to us, and that with every breath, there's an opportunity for an awareness of that gift. And I don't think you can get much more spiritual experience from that. And I think probably a lot of people just lying on the floor for a Feldenkrais lesson, the teacher saying, just notice what your breath is like right now, can have just like spontaneously, without me telling them, it just end up having that really very deep spiritual experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What is that stirring you, Maggie?
Yes, lots of things, but I'm very aware, as someone who used to be extremely asthmatic, but who is quite a lot better, that I was very, very good at not letting that breath in. This sort of reaction within asthma, that the sense of tension comes with so that you get very good at containing and preventing. And so learning to breathe with this sort of open, free, learning to allow the breath was actually really significant for me. And learning to extend the out breath was really significant for me. And I think some of the brilliance in the lessons that we have to offer people is a very safe, wellness generating way of holding breath, so that even when we're holding breath, we're not rigifying or fighting or preventing. So we hold, but we play with the rib movement, and we allow the abdomen to flow, and we discover that we can still soften our shoulders and our jaw, and this sort of fabulous paradoxical seesaw breathing process for me was the beginning of a certain kind of liberation. And we were playing with the bell when we had our discussion before, and you know, I think the bell mirrors this beautiful opening and closing and an in and outing of breath that you're talking about so beautifully, Josh. This sort of, it flows out into everything and comes back from everything, and is ancient, you know, this sort of lovely image as well, that we're breathing the air that Jesus was breathing, that Moses was breathing, that, you know, that it's the same air, it's the same substance. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but resilience is a powerful word, and I work with breathing a lot, not just for my own issues, but because I teach a lot of voice-related Feldenkrais processes, and I thought Buffy's presentation was magnificent, and if you haven't seen it yet, folks, you really will be delighted by the depth and complexity and you know, the coherence of how she explained what she was explaining. It was absolutely lovely. Really lovely.
Yeah, so we have this life that arises from this exchange of breath with the creator, perhaps at least that is the way it is in the stories that the 3 of us were raised with, right? Mm-hmm. And then we have this connection to the ground, this connection to the earth that's developed, which is really what Erin's interview was about, was how do we see ourselves, feel ourselves, be a part of not only our own experience, our own embodiment, but how we find ourselves in the world around us, in nature. seems also very, very reminiscent to me of, Adam and Eve finding their way in this incredible Garden of Eden, where there's a very palatable relationship that's congruent. And that at that point in the story, it was congruent with being human. There wasn't any sense of separation at that point.
It was an early problem for me as a very logical child. It seemed to me clear that free will was not a bad thing, and that remaining in an animal-like state would not be the pinnacle of creation. So when I was small, I argued a lot with the things I read in the Bible, and that was one of them. And therefore, this image of this snaky, Satan-y persona clearly was a vital part of. For me, very early on, it was obvious that if God was the source of everything, then you couldn't narrow what that everything was. You couldn't make it nice, and you couldn't make it male, and you couldn't make it old. You couldn't make it those things. It needed to be a much bigger, more complex process. And actually, you mentioned the earth, Cynthia, beautifully, and the earth mirrors that, because we're living on a complex system. We are a complex system living on a complex system within a complex system. So if we're going to find a kind of healthy ecology, all of those different systems need to interact in a healthy way, and a lot of that starts with feeling the ground beneath our feet and loving it.
A friend of mine, I member of a rather radical community called Chavurat Shalom in Somerville, Massachusetts, and we have a radical feminist liturgy. And one of the things that some people are uncomfortable is that, the word for God in Jewish prayer is Adonai, which means my master, my Lord. It's actually in plural. It's very strange. And my friend Eliza Arst pronounces instead, because that's not the word that's written. What's written is the four-letter name of God, and she pronounces it instead Adonai. It's a small difference between Adonai and Adonai, and Adonai Eden means foundation. And she takes it from a reference in the book of Exodus, where there's a description of the temple, of the Mishkan, the temple in the desert, that they make these poles that hold up the walls of the temple, go into these sockets that are the Adanim. And for me, when I pray and when I use that word, I'm aware of the foundation I stand on, right? And there's a part of the morning blessings that we say at the very beginning of the morning liturgy. There's a blessing for Roka ha'aretz el hamayim, who literally sort of pounds like a metalsmith, who creates the earth over the waters. Right, because if you look in the Genesis story, there's earth and there's water under, and there's a firmament and there's water over, and so this blessing of that, and that foundation, right, is the only place from which we can act, is where we are. And I know I think it was in Erin's presentation when she talked about returning again and again to this sort of practice of being aware of, I'm here. And I know I do that. She actually teaches a beautiful little practice. Again, I really recommend this, of ground, this sense of grounding of the breath, which we talked about, and then opening up to the sounds around you. That I do that as I enter prayer. I take a moment to just find myself and find myself in the environment in which we're, and I think I use that word, the environment, too. It's very important to me. Moshe Feldenkrais, at some point, there's a public workshop he did, I think in South Bend, where at the beginning he comes into the room and everybody's just lying anyway with you on the floor. And he says, no, you should line yourselves up. in a grid. And I think that's not very Feldenkrais, that we should all be lined up in a grid. Should we fit in like, but no, he said, because then you know what direction is what.
Yeah.
And he was, as a martial artist, very interested not only in terms of being centered in your center, but in your interaction with the environment and being potent in your interaction with the environment. And I remember when I was back, before I quite found that Judaism is how I was going to find a spiritual way of being, I remember listening to the radio and some singer-songwriter was being interviewed, and he said, sort of off the cuff, you know, the older I get, the more I feel like I have some grip on the relationship between myself and the cosmos, which is, I guess, what we call spirituality. That's been my working definition of spirituality ever since, right? That it's spirituality to me is about what's my relationship, you know, with myself, with my experience of myself, and with the world around me.
I have a similar definition. It's really being connected to something greater than myself, which for me is definitely this big cosmos, right? It's not, you know, there's like these concentric circles of cosmos radiating out, and maybe I'm the center of mine, but there just keeps being more and more and more and more, and then the degree to which I feel like I can include all of that in my experience is the depth of my own spirituality, and within that moment, I guess I would say. Yeah.
You know, the universe is expanding, but are you aware the universe is expanding from where you are? So it isn't expanding from some complicated middle that we don't know where it is. The universe is expanding from wherever we are outwards. And so this strange and fascinating combination of being so very, very tiny, and yet somehow in the center of it all, because it's all expanding outwards from us always. I am delighted by the complexity of physics bringing us back to these kind of metaphysical images, and not really being able to be separated from them, and the sort of the joy I have at the moment in quantum entanglement, and the fact that anything that's ever been in contact with itself remains in contact with that thing, no matter how far away from it it is, and the fact that we are all therefore connected through our cells, through our being made of stardust, is very, very exciting.
I like what you were saying about the center. There's a midrash about that a midrash again is something from the Jewish tradition that is a layer on top of the biblical texts, that God created, you know, if you look at the creation story, we think about the 2 by 2. And by the way, in chapter 1, human beings were also created male and female. But then we have the story about Adam being created a single person, right? And there's another teaching. Again, I don't have my fingertips where exactly this is from, that a person should carry 2 pieces of paper in their pockets, like one in each in every pocket. One of them should say, the whole world was created just for me, right? And that's what you're saying. The world, the universe is expanding from where I am. And if we're trying, and I think another thing that a word I want to put in here again, I'm historically not comfortable with the word God, but for me, it's trying to wrap my brain around like the entirety of existence. God is a great way of saying I'm going to relate to the entirety of existence. Anyway, so that's one of the notes that says the whole world was created just for me, or the whole world was created just for one person. And the other one says, I am but dust and ashes. Because that is true also. And Maggie, as you said, stardust, but after all, just dust. We just exist for this blip of time. And if I cease to exist tomorrow, sure, there would be quite a few people who would be pretty upset. But in the grander scheme of things, won't make any difference, right? And the way this is usually taught, and I think the way it's taught in the original text, is that, these are for different situations. Like there are times when I feel like I just don't matter. And there I should take out the note, remember the world's created for one person. And there are times when I think it's all about me and I have to remember, really, I'm just dust and ashes. But I remember noticing in my Feldenkrais training there on the floor that, oh, they're both true simultaneously. And then that's the spiritual truth, that both of those are true. My experience, and that the Feldenkrais method really helps us realize how much of our experience we create through the process of our experience, right? So my experience of the world is my experience of the world. The world revolves around my experience of it. Maybe it's a little bit Epicurean, right? Where the Talmudic rabbis had problems with Epicureans. That was their word for apostate, was an Epicurean. But that the whole world that I experience is the world as I experience it, right? I think this is the book, The Four Agreements. This also comes up. We're each living in our own dream, right? We recognize that everybody else is too. And they're the center.
Each nervous system is unique. Sorry to interrupt, but every, not just human, but very much because we're talking about human spirituality, every nervous system is unique. Every one of us has produced something that is absolutely individual and only overlaps with others in some incidental areas. And we can never know for sure what someone else is perceiving. All we can do, I think, is, and this is what I think Feldenkrais, with its gentle movement, its attention to what's going on all the time, it enables you to improve that perceptive experience so that it widens, so that it becomes possible to hold your own self in your heart, the one bit of paper, and at the same time recognize all the people around you as well and start to have both available. It is what that quieting is about, isn't it? You used the word antenna, Cynthia, and I think it's sort of spot on in our original conversation, that we are we're refining our perception to pick up more and more and more. And there was a wonderful bit of research for the sensitivity of fingertips. Have you come across this? They were working with a group of people, and as they produced as frictionless a surface as possible. And after a little bit of practice and a little bit of time, the people in the experiment could detect 13 nanometers of substance under their fingers. This is smaller than some bacteria. It's really, really minute. And it was lovely because it was celebrating what a fabulous piece of kit this is. But I think they didn't realize the neuroplasticity aspect of it, that those people, by tending to their fingertips and doing this over and over again, were refining and refining and refining. And who knows how small that might have got if they'd had more time.
This brings us back to our relationship to the environment, and I just want to bring out something that somebody just wrote in the comments of that. I
realize I'm missing the
word.
Yeah,
it's hard.
We'll just try to stay here for a
Well,
minute.
no, somebody said that the word atom comes from Adama, which is earth, and that has to do with the fact, this idea that Adam is created from the earth, that we are in relationship, not just to each other, but to the rest of existence. And I think that what you were saying about the neuroplasticity involved brings us into another theme that just kept coming up again and again in the three talks, which is practice, right? And practice in the sense of having a practice, having a practice, and that practice sensitizes us. Right? It can go either way. Practice can also numb us. We can habituate to our experience. And Larry Goldfarb talks about this a lot. But that the practice of prayer, people who have prayer and meditation practices, I think are a lot about what you're describing of those people feeling what happens to your reception when you spend some time on a surface that has almost no friction, and then you can feel something, that we spend time sensitizing ourselves. What it is that we sensitize ourselves to is a question of what it is that we practice. What is the nature of meditation practice, of our prayer practice, etc., or our Feldenkrais practice, right? But that we are fine-tuning this amazing bit of kit that you, as you put it, right, to be sensitive, to develop this kind of awareness. It's another word that I'm not sure we brought into this conversation yet, which is essential, I think.
Well, it's you know, prayer, for Larry's topic, prayer is sometimes thought of an act of as talking to God. And I think that it can for sure be talking to God, talking to the big cosmos, or whatever, however you define that, with whatever words you use. But I also think that perhaps the largest teaching in most practices is the ability to hear God. That is, to be open enough that you hear, that you become somehow quiet enough within oneself, that you have a sense of the embodiment of God within you being so clear, a voice so clear, a presence so clear, whether it's your tradition is the Holy Spirit or whatever your tradition is, so clear in you that you no longer feel separate. You feel connected, you feel held, you feel at some kind of level of peace because of that connection. And I think that the Feldenkrais work, which is, we want to make clear, and we'll do that here in a minute, it is not a religious work, right? It is not. You said he was a secular Jew. He was definitely anti anything that smacked of rigidity or telling people how to live.
Or extrapolating beyond the detectable presence of the substance of life.
He was, that would be also true of him, I think.
He was anti-chi in a way that as a Tai Chi person not.
Anti-speculation about what else is out there.
Well, one of the things that's so important to me, I think I'd say, in the Moshe Feldenkrais's approach, the Feldenkrais method's approach to being, you know, not religious at all, right? He was a scientist first and foremost. So everything needed to be of a sort of evidence-based, but he understood something about subjective evidence, right? That you should learn from your own experience. And what he did was devise experiences from which people can learn. And one of the interesting things is that there's somewhere in the book Awareness the Movement where he says, as people do this movement, each person will feel more and more like themselves, their unique self, right, as they do it. And then he said something even more fascinating. And if you look out around the room, you'd see that people are starting to move more and more alike. Because after all, we have the same structure. And by structure, he included the nervous system, right? It's a fascinating thing. But putting any idea that purports to say something about the human experience, putting it to that test of, does that feel right to me? Right? Has been an essential thing in allowing me to take on a relationship with religion. And I don't use faith very much because though there are ways to bring the word faith into this, it's a little tricky, and I'm not going to try and thread that particular needle, but that's been very important for me, because it is very easy with spiritual practices to get caught up in the theory of it. That sounds like a great idea. Or to get caught in the dogma and the idea of, this is how it is. This is what you're supposed to believe. And then if I don't believe that, there's something wrong with me. And I think for a lot of people who reject religion, such as I rejected religion for a very long time. It is because of those things that we tend to reject religion. And the fact is that there's an awful lot of religious experience and spiritual experience that's not religious. I completely respect, along with that is actually brought about by experience. And doesn't have to stand in contrast to experience. And I think that the Feldenkrais method, I mean, I guess I'm trying to get at is that I know a lot of fundamentalist atheists. They have a firm faith in the lack of the existence of God, and they have a firm faith in science being opposite to religion. And well, this is another dogma, right?
It's a really seriously dominant dogma at the moment.
Yeah, I guess I should be careful with the word dogma because it doesn't not come from my tradition, you know.
There's a wonderful man who talks about cells and the life of cells, Bruce Lipton, and he's incredibly enthusiastic. He's like looking at a Labrador teaching science, but his science background is very, very deep. And he makes it clear that they use the word dogma when they talk about certain aspects of science. So they don't shy away from it, even though you would expect when people are looking all the time for clarity that they would be wary of that word, that they would not want.
So I mean, we can turn anything into a dogma, and we can become dogmatic Feldenkrais practitioners, and maybe even went through that stage. I certainly think I've been through that stage. So there's a stage in the what I would call the early experience of it that we can be a little over evangelical. I used to be in a building with tango dancers, and I used to say, my God, those tango dancers are even more evangelical than Feldenkrais people. I mean, they spent all day long trying to convince everybody else to do tango. And it was 30 years into their practice, they were still trying to convince people to do tango. They never stopped. There was a certain kind of tenacity with it. I was like, wow, that is something. So we can take anything and make it dogmatic or think that everybody else has to experience it. And I think also, I do want to say that I am not against people being conservative in their religious beliefs or having a conservative religious system. I'm really actually not against that. I think we're in a time in our country where, and around the world, where there's a lot of polarization around that. I believe people ought to have the choice to choose their religious belief system. I have a little problem once it starts to be tried to be projected on other people, but I've seen plenty of us who are in the spiritual but not religious groups that do the same thing and say conservative religious people don't have a right to have their beliefs either. So it's a really touchy thing. It's and I want to make clear that for me anyway, whatever you think is fine with me, and whatever makes your life more worth living is fine with me, and gives you some sense of support. There's something that Moshe did very young, and it reminded me today. I was thought of it today because I was raised with a lot of rules, and one of the rules was you shall not drink alcohol. So I poured myself some sparkling wine. I'm still not much of an alcohol drinker, but I thought tonight I would sip on this wine while I thought about Moshe being 14 years old and doing what, Josh?
Oh, well, so first of all, Jews drink alcohol.
I know they drink alcohol, but he had something else.
So they definitely drank alcohol. It depends. There are lots of different.
Yeah, that's my religion. Yeah.
It's the Muslims who mostly. Anyway, to my knowledge. Yes. Okay. So it's a great story about Moshe's relationship with dogmatic religion. So when he was was he 14 when he decided to move from where he was in a place that was sometimes Poland and sometimes Russia and sometimes Lithuania. I think now it's Lithuania. And he decided he was a Zionist. He was going to go and move to the land of Israel, to Palestine. And become a new sort of Jew who settles the land and works in the land. And on his way, he was hungry and he went to eat somewhere. And I don't know the origin of the story, but the story goes, all they had there was pork. It was in the story I heard, it was a pork pie. I think I heard bacon, whatever. All they had was pork. And of course, he was Jewish. And if you grew up as a Jew, you do not touch pork. That's the epitome of not kosher. And he had some because he was hungry, and he said, I don't believe in that. I don't hold by that. And he promptly threw up. And I know observant Jews who have grown up and have never eaten pork, and they say the smell of bacon makes them nauseous. And so what does the young Moshe Feldenkrais do? He goes back and buys another one because he does not want to be locked into something. He sees these other people eat this and they're fine. The only reason I can't eat this is because I've been habituated not to. And so I don't know how many times he goes back to there and buys another one of those till he can hold it down, till he feels free from the constraints of a system that he feels is imposed on him. And I don't know, maybe that's a good invitation to all of us if we feel like we have some sort of dogma. It's to try out doing things differently and then say, no, there's a reason I do it this way. I don't eat pork, and that's my choice. Like, it's tasty, but that's okay. I don't need it. And I've chosen to take on a certain structure of ideas and of practices, more like a certain structure of practices.
There's something lovely in being part of a community.
Yeah, it's being part of the community, but I would say there's something else. There's something about having mindful practice. There's a tradition in Judaism of saying 100 blessings a day. Now, if you do the traditional liturgy and you pray all the times you're supposed to pray, that covers like 80 something. And you don't have to look for a lot, but you say a blessing before you put anything in your mouth, except for water. But you say a blessing for anything you eat. You say a blessing when you go to the bathroom. And that blessing, by the way, is my blessing for doing Feldenkrais. And it is acknowledging that we've been made with many tubes and ducts and complexities in our bodies, that if one of them were closed, that should be open, one of them was open, that should be closed, we wouldn't survive very long. So we are grateful for this source of life. And that kind of awareness as we go through life of noting everything is a blessing for waking up. Well, a prayer you say when you wake up, there's a blessing for going to sleep. That whatever you do has an acknowledgement of the spiritual dimension to it. That's not unakin to what happens when you do a lot of Feldenkrais. And suddenly you realize you don't pick up a glass of water without being aware of the weight of that glass and the shift of my weight on my seat as my center of gravity moves, because I've incorporated that weight. And am I pulling my shoulder up, or am I letting it be long? What are the options? What are the choices I'm making? So keeping kosher, not drinking alcohol. For a lot of traditions that don't drink alcohol and do not do drugs, it is because to keep that, to remain aware, right? And I think that one of the things that has been that's implied, I think, is this entire spiritual series of recordings is in terms of the relationship to religion. Is Feldenkrais doing something so that you have a spiritual experience, right? There are certain things that are spiritual experiences that we have when we engage with Feldenkrais, and we're sort of bringing that out, pointing that out. And on the other hand, does doing Feldenkrais, which is not a religion in any way, shape, or form, right? Aside from this fact that there's something spiritual in it, how does it contribute to our experience of religion, those of us who do practice a religion or a spiritual discipline, right? So for instance, there are a lot of people who practice martial arts or yoga as a spiritual discipline.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there is anything spiritual in the work. I think there might be something spiritual inherently in being human. I don't know that there's anything spiritual in the work. I mean, I think that there is humans' desire to make sense out of life seems to me to be spiritual, and everyone does it, whether you're an atheist or you have a very specific other belief system, everyone tries to make sense out of life. They try to make sense out of their suffering. They try to make sense out of their success. They try to figure out what their relationship to the world around them means. And when they have success, don't have success, you have a tornado, you ask these questions, why me? Which we have all, I would imagine every single person's had the chance to ask. Those are spiritual moments. And I think Feldenkrais is just, it's not any more spiritual than maybe any other form of exploration of the human experience. Maggie?
And any other kind of philosophy, any other kind of approach to psychology. I mean, you know, very often people are interested in these things, but they give them a different label, they give them a different title.
Yeah.
Religion is different. Religion has practices that are quite distinct, but spirituality is this enormously flexible and fluid. And I do see it there, but I see it because I think there was an understanding of the benefits of learning, and that therefore learning required this beginner's mind that Zen training is so very clear about. And so this idea that the only principle in Feldenkrais is that there are no principles is, I think, one of the most powerful ideas for approaching all kinds of aspects of life. And, you know, when I grabbed for the word kit earlier, I was really aiming not to fall into the habit of using mechanistic metaphors, which are so very limited when it comes to discussing the complexity of the system that we are. So I think I've talked myself into a weird corner, but this is that anti-dogma phrase, the only principle, that you've got to be so careful when you're teaching something to people, not to get wrapped up in making it more solid so that it's easier to transfer. And I think he built in strategies to prevent that from happening. Little protective things to keep it growing and expanding and not becoming rigidified.
Yeah. I mean, it's so easy to end up with rules. You know, a rule in a Feldenkrais training might be that you have to always have your shoes off. And you should, you know, maybe be barefoot more than with socks on. It might be in a yoga training. So, I mean, these are things that you don't think of as being dogma, but they become dogma. And you know it by the time, as soon as someone breaks the rule, right? Somebody chooses to do it differently, and the whole group has a kind of collective deep breath or something, and as they try to grapple with what does it mean that somebody didn't choose to sit on a cushion and they chose to sit in a chair. So it's very easy to have happen. I'm going to start working in some of these comments. People have more comments than questions on this topic, which I find also interesting. So this is from Maria. She said, spiritual is more philosophical in the sense that man is spiritual because he can have concept, etc. Even if now it is often true that spiritual is mixed with religion. Religious is about the religion. So she goes on to talk about studying theology and philosophy, and her role in the International Feldenkrais Federation, in which she was really trying to help people become careful about not mixing up the Feldenkrais method with New Age stuff, which I think is important. And that she also went to the Vatican because they had listed Feldenkrais method as part of New Age, basing it on a particular book. And it's as Larry, I agree that it is very important that we bring Feldenkrais method to our religious community without mixing with religion. It has to be open to all religions without becoming part of one. Why? Because the Feldenkrais method helps the human person's flourishing. I like that sentence.
I like that sentence a lot.
Flourishing, yes. Yeah, so, I have been asked a couple of times, is this going to make me be in conflict with my religion? Is this going to make me change my religion? And what I have seen, I've never seen anyone change their religion because of the Feldenkrais method. I have seen people who were conservative Christians that I would say became better conservative Christians. And I would say I've seen people who were New Age that became better New Age people. I mean, and I don't know what I mean by better there. I just mean more available somehow, more, I don't mean more dogmatic. I just mean they became more available to their belief set. And What's
And more
different?
engaged. I mean,
More engaged.
more engaged in their faith. And what I was talking about before about paying attention to your experiences and deepening your experience with being a human who has experiences. And if your religious tradition, whatever it is something you're spending time paying attention to, then it will give you back more. Your experience of life, I think, becomes richer when you pay attention to it. And the Feldenkrais method is a way of paying attention to your experience of life. And that includes religion. There was a story, people who are interested about Moshe Feldenkrais's connection with the Jewish tradition should look at David Cates's book, Making Connections, the Hasidic Roots and Resonances of the Feldenkrais Method. And he brings a text by Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz, who was an ancestor of Moshe Pinchas Feldenkrais. This is his middle name after this guy, who said, when I pray, sometimes I spend a period, I think like a week, paying attention to exactly what I do with my left hand, something like that. I have to look at the text again. He had somewhere else where he said, whenever movement I do has resonances in all levels of existence. If I move my hand this way or move my hand that way, it has a resonance, right? But this idea of paying attention to what you do, if you pay attention to what you do when you pray, that's going to change your experience of prayer. If you pay attention to what you do while you drive your car, it will make a difference to the way you drive. Now, whether you're paying more attention to what you do with your body and how you hold the steering wheel, which make a difference to your comfort, but if you do that at the expense of what's outside you, then maybe that's part of awareness needing to include the world around us as well as the world inside us. I had one of my first teachers said something about the Feldenkrais method being like an upgrade to your OS. Everything runs better.
It runs better, yeah. So Patrick wanted us to talk a little bit about the rubbish in the Torah and the Bible. And he says that with respect, irreverence, and humor. And actually, Patrick, I want to acknowledge your statement, but we're not going to go there, because the topic is really not religion. It's about the spiritual experience of individuals. So I don't think it's going to be helpful if we start dissecting out people's spiritual texts at this point, but I understand your interest and appreciate.
I think I can say a word for that while honoring what you just said.
Yeah.
Because I think that comes back to what I was talking about before, about when you have your experience, right? That you're paying attention to your experience. And different traditions, nobody reads the Bible and just does the Bible. Some people say they do, but nobody does. Everybody has to have an interpretation. That document is so multi-voiced that the first two books, like I mentioned this already, human beings were born male and female. Then God created Adam.
Yeah, and it's true of all.
How you take that in is what's, I think, relevant to our conversation.
Right. Yeah.
And back to the question of, is it going to make you change your religion? I think it's going to make you change you, and it's going to make you become more you. And if
I don't think
more
it makes
you
anything,
involves,
I want to change the word "make." I don't think it makes.
Doesn't make anything, right? It provides an opportunity.
I want to just change that word.
Yeah, it provides an opportunity for you to change within yourself. And I remember at the end of the first segment of my Feldenkrais training, a trainer talked about how, you might be experiencing yourself and you're experiencing your environment and experiencing your relationship differently. And at some point halfway through the talk, he said, so yes, this is the don't go home and get a divorce talk. Mm-hmm. Right? That we need to be aware that we're changing and that our perceptions of the world are changing. And I think that our perceptions of the people that we're in relationship with change, and the perceptions of the communities we're in relationship change and our perceptions of our thoughts change. And I don't think that it's actually, to agree with you, it's not the Feldenkrais method that makes that happen. It's life that makes that happen. But when you're paying attention, change has a tendency to happen. And I think that that's why you say that you've seen people of all sorts of religions find that their experience with their spiritual tradition deepens. It's because their experience with themselves and with their lives and with the way they interact with the world around them deepens.
Mm-hmm. Spy says, and I think this will be a good one for you to take off on, Maggie, what if the world wasn't about us or I, and it was all about the others, the way we affect other people's lives? If we were all one, then we would still be taking care of ourselves in that sense. Oh, I have to take that in for a minute.
Okay, that's interesting. Yes, growing up in a Christian tradition, the idea of loving your neighbor as yourself. I'm not sure if I've quite got what this person is asking, but yes, I don't.
Yeah, and he or she, I'm not sure what, or they, is indicating that there's no I, maybe there's only we. Maybe there's only we, and if there's only we, when you take care of quotes I, you're taking care of we.
Yes, but it takes away so much of experience, doesn't it, to sort of attempt to make oneself fit into that pattern. I believe some people do it spontaneously and experience it as a kind of enlightenment. I'm extraordinarily bad at switching off the words in my head. So nearly always when I get anywhere with my own self-quieting, it's rarely more than a few moments that I get to that place where the I isn't chatting away at some point inside. But I think what is, for me, always the most useful is if you have an idea of how the world works, how experience is, live it, explore it, try it out. Does it really work to try and live your life from day to day, removing the sense of I, removing the sense of who you are and what you're aiming for? I'm not sure that that's practical outside of a monastic environment.
Mm. Well, I see what you're saying, Maggie. I guess I do feel like, I think though, as a practice for me to consider that what I do for myself and for someone else is maybe the same thing in many ways is not a bad idea either. Mm-hmm. I mean,
I'm not saying bad, just try it out.
I'm kind of liking the spin on it for me. Mm. It's a common practice for me at the things that I can be aware of. So let's just acknowledge that there's a huge amount of things I'm not aware of, but it's a common practice for me to be asking myself, is this the right thing for me to do? Is it the right thing for me to do for more than just me? You know, like what's the reverberation of that? And I'm acknowledge that I'm quite limited in how many times I ask that question, if you will, but I like the spin that this person is giving it, that kind of gives me a sense of how that might be embodied in me, how I might be able to do that. And I think Erin was calling us to that in her talk. She was saying, look, I'm not for this practice of being with yourself, being present, being calm as anesthesia for what we're doing to the earth. Boy, that was powerful, wasn't it?
Yeah,
that was tremendous.
Yes, it was. But you've made me realize that one of the reasons that The Potent Self was the book that I found the most effective from a point of view of understanding how Feldenkrais was going to expand my experience of life was the discussion right at the beginning when he talks about being compulsively nice. So the discovering within yourself that you do not have to be good, that it is not breaking a rule to allow yourself to be nice to yourself as well as to the people around you. Because I was one of those compulsively nice people. I was someone who tried extraordinarily hard to be nice in a way that was imposed from outside rather than discovered from inside. And actually, I consider part of my spiritual practice to have been attempting to reverse that so that the niceness is from the inside out, and therefore it becomes more like kindness, and it becomes more like compassion, and considerably less like niceness. But I could tell that I was one of the people he was talking to when he wrote that. So I think that's probably why I'm a little sensitized to the idea of removing the I, because I think I was brought up to have myself be the invisible one who had to make everybody else feel better all the time.
That's a great reflection.
Well,
I can totally see that.
The two notes, right?
Definitely
right. Yeah. The question is, what if it's not all about me in a way that's doesn't negate me? Right.
Or oppress. I mean, I was busy oppressing myself long after the original oppression was in place.
Right.
Like the flea with the flea that's inside the cup that's got a lid on, and so after a while it doesn't jump high enough to jump out of the. You take the lid away, and the flea's already learnt that it's supposed to stay within that sort of space. A little bit like that.
Yeah, I totally relate to that, and I do think that's one of the things of the Feldenkrais method. In part, I mean, I don't think it was the only thing that it did that for me, but in part helped me to break free of the sort of confines that I was given as a child, but then kept. Right? There's a stage at which you have to break free from the confines that you were given in order to explore the world around you. I'm going to try to say this name, maybe Bayala, I'm not sure, says, my use of prayer and this practice synonymously. So how does prayer done in repentance stimulate the neural cortex differently than prayer done in reverence?
Wow.
That question.
Good question.
Do we increase our chi flow when we believe we are rectifying a mistake?
I don't know about to answer, do we? Definitely can't. In Judaism, there's an interesting question, like, do we pray out of love? Or do we pray out of awe and fear, right? And there isn't an answer. Like, for some people, some thinkers say, really, this is why we pray. And some people say, well, this is why we pray. This is within the Orthodox world where prayer is an obligation. So I don't know quite what if that answers the question. It just sort of validates, it just doesn't even validate the question. It gives another connection. There are, who is it who said that what are the essential prayers? The essential prayers are help me, thank you, and wow. Maybe I'm sorry, which was the repentance.
But I'm not aware of anything. I'm so aware there's been a lot of research into gratitude. There's a lot of scientific evidence for the benefits of gratitude. I'm not aware anyone's properly looked into repentance in a way that would answer that question in a more established manner. But it does sound like a fabulous thing to try in one's own life.
It's resonating, and it's resonating a little bit with a couple of themes that are in the three talks. And I'm thinking especially, Aaron's the one that you just brought up, Cynthia, not wanting to be anesthesia. There's a great story by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, which was a great writer of popular theology. Theology is a strange word in Judaism. Judaism isn't a theological religion. It's a practice religion. You can think about how that relates to Moshe Feldenkrais' thinking. But he told this story about how he got up at the end of a high holiday service and overheard two ladies talking behind him. And one of them said to the other, "Wasn't that a lovely service?" And he was horrified. He said, high holiday services, which are about repentance, they're about judgment, they should not be lovely. They should shake you to your core and make you reevaluate your relationship with your life and our collective responsibility for what's happening in this world. There's and then Aaron later was talking about softening in the belly and how that can be very difficult, because in that tightness in our belly, that's where we're holding back all sorts of feelings that we don't want to have, that we don't know how to deal with, that we're afraid of dealing with, right? And this idea of resilience, right, that comes up in both her and Buffy's talk, of being able to handle uncomfortable things. And being able to be present with discomfort. Anybody who's gotten into the Feldenkrais method to deal with chronic pain has had to deal with this at some point, has had to deal with getting to the point of no longer shying away from the pain, but just accepting that it's there, and that so long as I'm shying away from it, it's not going to go away. It's just part of my experience. And that shying away that shies us away from our experience, right? And that these practices are about coming back and coming back. In Hebrew, that coming back is called teshuvah, which is our word for repentance.
Right. Interesting. Interesting. I loved Erin's Hello, Sweetheart.
I loved it.
And I have been doing that because chronic pain has been one of my own teaching, one of my own books.
You want to say for people who haven't seen her video?
Will I be able to convey it beautifully enough? She just this sort of, I had for a long time a leftover fibromyalgic-like pain in this arm, and I lived with it. I just got used to it and lived with it. And quite often I couldn't lift my arm above about here. And I just, and then I'm teaching a class and I'm doing my best not to move my arms when I'm teaching my class, and feeling embarrassed by it, but not really knowing what to do. And then when I got ready to figure out how to deal with it, which involved using some of these sort of deep auto-suggestion ideas that are there in very, very early way of looking at what Feldenkrais does, which is to go right inside and pay attention to the sensation. I found a way to play with sensation in a way that sort of eased the arm. And now every so often there'll be a little twinge. And I thought something that isn't Hello, Sweetheart, but Hello, Sweetheart is such a perfect way of describing how you embrace it, that her words have now dominated mine, and I can't remember what I used to think. I used to think something that I'm now forever, it's going to be Hello, Sweetheart, you're back. Hello, little pain, you're back. Yeah. I love you. I appreciate you. Every single pain we get when we're Feldenkrais practitioners teaches us to help someone else. It is the most beneficial thing to be uncomfortable.
Taffy says in Erin's interview of compassionate embodiment, she guided us in a lesson that was very difficult for me. To do it, I felt I cheated a little by needing a strong visualization to track, to feel the sensations, to transfer a positive sensation to a negative sensation. Any ideas how to help get into this more spiritual side of myself? Then she later says, I see the benefit of growing towards positive experiences that we'd like to incorporate into our life and become a habit. And your discussion is helping me to see the quotes light. So, I mean, Maggie, what could you offer her is in between?
Yeah, I did go looking for the self-hypnosis side of things. Before I found Feldenkrais, I started looking for self-help, things that would help me, because I was in pain and I was stressed as well. I was an anxious, tense 20-year-old. And I kept finding books that said something along the lines of, well, I did this and it was good, and I did this and it was good, and I did this was good, and I learned meditation and now I'm healed. But I couldn't meditate. I was absolutely hopeless. And that's how I ended up in Tai Chi, because I think the kind of person I am is much happier doing. And this lovely, slow, attentive doing was so effective for me, but it did not heal my knees. My knees carried on to be something that hurt me. And so I then did, I was very lucky. I was in a small town on the coast called Brighton, and Garrett Newell, who came over to Britain with the intention of starting a training course, moved to my town and started teaching in my local natural health centre where I did my Tai Chi. And I limped in with sciatic pain. And at the end of that session, the pain had gone. It usually took about 7 days. So very early on, I had this sort of fabulous discovery that movement could be not just the way I hurt myself, because the reason I had sciatica was because of the way I went about dancing. So this shift into movement suddenly becoming something that could heal me. But many years later, I developed chronic fatigue, something that also embarrasses me as a Feldenkrais practitioner. I still had a lot to learn about pacing myself. And the fibromyalgic pain was chronic and did not respond well to movement. And I needed to find something much, much subtler. And so I went back into Feldenkrais looking for that imagination work, working very, very gently with myself. The bell was one of the first things that really opened my experience, and I knew there was more in there. And then they produced that little thinking and doing monograph of what Feldenkrais had written in discussion of the auto-suggestion book from Coué. And I thought, hypnosis is right deep in this work. It's not missing from this work. It's been transmuted into something very, very effective, but it's there for me to uncover. And I think that there are lessons tucked away that perhaps don't get taught as often as they could do, like plain dividing the self, bringing the attention inside, finding the central line within yourself and learning to attend to it in this really clear way. That was so much of a clue of that hypnotherapeutic side of things, that one could use one's mind to open up the internal space in a way that created flow and lowered discomfort. And for me, brought coordination back. My balance improved from that as well.
I feel like what you've given us, Maggie, is you've said, don't settle on one thing. If something doesn't work for you, there's a lot of options. So maybe Erin's Hello Sweetheart resonates with you, and maybe for someone else, it just doesn't right now. It doesn't mean it won't resonate next week or a year from now, but it doesn't right now.
Yeah, that's also true. I think it took me 30 years to come around to this again.
Yeah. Mm. As I heard the question was sort of like, should I be doing this or should I be doing that? And I was like, the Feldenkrais method, you find the lesson that does this and the lesson that does that, and maybe the lesson that has you do this and then do that and then this and then that, right? Just attend to what's there. Most of Feldenkrais, every once in a while, he says, imagine that you're something else that you're not, right? Because that's the principle of no principle he worked with, and he was very aware that of our capacity of imagination being incredibly powerful. Mm-hmm. Russell Delman, who Erin references, and I know he'll be speaking tomorrow, right?
He was my educational director. And
lovely. I've really very much enjoyed working with him, and he says that Moshe Feldenkrais was as interested in the movements of the mind and the movements of thought and the movements of attention as the movements of the body.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I think that when we notice that, if I go to say, hello, sweetheart, to a pain in my knee, and my response is really a negative one, that tells us something. And that may not be a loop I want to grow, right? So if for me, that is what the loop is going to end up growing, is another variation on the negativity, I would say, go do something different. And there's so many options. Actually, Maggie has listed out several here. I want to answer a couple more questions.
Yes, please.
So Holly, I'm going to answer this one really easy. What is OS? It means operating system, from the terms of computer systems. So if you could upgrade your operating system, sometimes when you have a difficulty, they'll say, are you up to the latest operating system? And it makes everything perform better. Sharon asks, could someone speak about the newborn infant's first breath? It happens typically within 10 seconds of breath to inflate the lungs to full capacity, which reconfigures circulation and activation of the nervous system. How does this play into our patterns of breath? Well, Sharon, I got to tell you right away, you actually know more about it than I do. Do either of you know more about this than I do? Here's what I got on it. And it's not very much because I've been following a couple people's work, and I don't work with infants really at all. I've worked with a few children, and a few people fairly young, as in 2 and 3 months, but not a true newborn. And there is something interesting, I understand, in the way that first breath is taken, and as the tongue comes up against the top of the palate, will help to start to form the shape of the palate and release the airway. And so there's some interesting things that happen apparently in that last moment of the spiraling out in the natural childbirth process. It does not happen, for example, if the child is born breech or born cesarean. I think this is where a lot of craniosacral therapists see their work as being particularly powerful for newborns. But it's not my specialty at all. So I'm afraid that we need to have you on to answer that question.
Yeah, the two thoughts I have, one of them is personal experience, and one of them is lore of Moshe Feldenkrais' teaching. The personal experience is realizing that having watched my son be born and realized that he was born tilted to one side, like in utero, he was apparently, one side, and and then year so later he's in one of those bouncy seats, and my mother says, how come he always loses his left sock first when he's kicking his toes? I'm like, oh, that's because that's his short side habitually from before he was born. So that our habits go back to in utero. That's one thing that I've just noticed. The other one, though, is I think very much Feldenkrais, because our habits are not our destiny. And our experiences are not our destiny. And I can't remember which of my teachers it is who would say, it's very possibly Deborah Lotus, who said that when Moshe Feldenkrais would work with somebody and observe something about them, they would say, why is that? And Feldenkrais would say, did your mother breastfeed you? And the person would say yes or no. It didn't matter. He said, that's why. So, very possibly what happens with that first breath may actually be an interesting explanation of a certain patterns that a person has. Just like the way my son came out, was in utero, has some explanation to his patterns. At the same time, it's also not destiny, and that's one of the interesting things about this work.
Yeah.
Liz says, this may not be pertinent, but I've heard the translation of Yahweh as the present becoming the future that can and should be. In other words, God is a verb.
Yes. Yes. Do you want me to speak to that for a bit? Okay. So let's see if we can hold. So past in Hebrew is haya, hey, yud, hey. Presence in Hebrew is hove, hey, vav, hey. And future in Hebrew is yihye, yud, hey, yud, hey. God is yud, hey, vav, hey. It is a collapsing of, so some people translate God's name as was is will be. And interestingly, when Moses says, who should I say sent me at the burning bush? God says, Ehiyeh asher ehiyeh. I translate often, I am that I am. Maybe it's I will be what I will be. Maybe it is I am the unfolding that is becoming.
Nice.
I don't think there's much more to say.
The way that can be named is not the way.
So I asked a very practical question. How are the lessons being categorized in the Feldenkrais practices? Are they sorted by focusing on where the pain shows? Maggie?
Oh, okay. Who's categorizing them?
That's a question.
That's,
Is anybody doing
there
that?
you go.
Yeah, I don't know. I suspect every teacher categorizes slightly differently. And for me, it's an interesting question because I started out, because I had Garrett in my hometown, I could see how she organized a whole year of classes. So when I started organizing my own classes, I'd seen an experienced teacher's way of patterning lessons, and they kind of had a developmental feel in the direction. So there was a first where folding and flexing, we're exploring that very early baby experience. At some point we're ready to roll onto our fronts and start to explore that kind of baby experience. There was a logic to it, and then yes, I tended to start to organize things into areas. This lesson has a lot of movement in this area, and now I don't. Now it's something else, but that's taken 30 years. Now I go to a class and I don't have a whole lesson prepared. I wait to see what emerges, and I'm loving that, and I'm finding it very pleasant to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, the improvising. There was a wonderful story from Mia. Was it Mia Siegel talking about being in the car with Feldenkrais on his way to, I think it was an Alexander Yanai, and her saying, well, you haven't prepared anything? He said, oh, I teach the same thing every time. I just use a different process to do it.
Yes, so no, we do not categorize lessons by pain officially. We would say that would be very faulty. I will tell you that in my own practice, if I'm trying to appeal to new people, I will categorize lessons in that way. But I could have chosen a lot of different lessons to go into that category, and I could take those same lessons and sometimes put them into something different. I also have my own online library where I categorize things by what I think they could possibly be helpful for, but I recognize that it could then turn around and be a lesson that's in the imagination that would be the most helpful for a person. I mean, it's very difficult because really, you know, we're under some illusion that what causes each person's pain in a knee is the same thing. That is not true. That's just not true. And it's not even true that we can tell you why your knee is in pain. We can't. We can have a hypothesis about it, but in the end, you could turn around and say out of nowhere, oh my gosh, I just felt something somebody said to me as a child that was really horrible come up and gone, and my pain is gone. Or the practitioner could work with you on your back and your pain is gone. And that was the practitioner's hypothesis. And we think that turns out to be correct because the pain left, but we really don't know, because what we're working with is your whole nervous system changing, So.
And also very practically, very often these pains come back. So in the long term, what we're hoping is that to transfer a way of approaching the way we do, so that that person, the next time they feel the discomfort, has some strategies there, some possibilities to play with, so that their own pain becomes something they can manage, and they're not so much in need of somebody else's teaching.
Well, I think that you've just broken some heretical code by saying pains come back. So
yes, you know,
I'm not signing up for the Feldenkrais method, Maggie. What is up with that? You're just totally blowing my cover.
You know, when you're hypermobile, I'm hypermobile. Bits of me are too loose, and you know, pain became my life.
You know, Larry Goldfarb, you can watch his talk, but he's just one of the most articulate thinkers about this work. Yeah, says something. Now he's very quotable, but I can't find the quote at the moment. But he basically says, you know, it's just a sign that your nervous system is working. You stay you.
Yeah.
Right. You can change and you can grow, but the truth is that what was who you are coming to this work or anything stays who you are. You just become more yourself in some way. You become, students have said to me, oh, my pain's back. But you know what the difference is? When I first started coming to you, I would be devastated that my pain's back. And I'm like, oh, my pain's back. I know it comes and it goes.
Any second now it'll be, hello, sweetheart, you're back.
Yeah. But something to the spiritual bit of it though, and we're coming back to teshuva, repentance, right? That I don't know about other religious practices, but in Judaism, there's an annual cycle for repentance, right? That becomes really focused on the high holidays. And, people have been doing this for a while. You start doing it, they're like, oh my God, I'm becoming so aware of my habits and these things that I do. People experience great transformation around it. And then years later, they're like, wait, I'm apologizing for the same things. Again and again and again, I'm coming back. It's just about coming back. You come back to your breath when you're a meditator. You come back to the mantra. You come back to the experiences. And that is the experience of being alive. That's the pain. That's the pain I think we shy away from, right? Is the pain that, oh, I'm doing that again. Yeah. And if I shy away from that pain, well, I'm definitely going to keep doing it. But if I'm present with it and I can tell myself, oh, sweetheart, and I think for me, and this is a gift I got from Russell Delman, actually, not directly, but I understood it from something he said to me. For me, this is where God comes into the picture, right? So on the one hand, I believe God is the emergence that is becoming, and God is the universe. But when I pray, I'm talking to somebody. Apparently, who am I talking to? I'm talking to, I need to be witnessed by the spiritual universe. That was Russell's words for when I talked about needing to be witnessed in meditation. It's like, that's where God comes in. And sometimes that which is hurting me, that which I'm doing that is hurting me, whether it's my interpersonal habits or my movement habits, or that which is hurting me, which I can't figure out if it has anything to do with something I'm doing, it's just some pain that I'm carrying or experiencing. I have to bring that somewhere. And to feel like there is a foundation way back at the beginning of our conversation, there's karka olam, there's a ground for the world. I think I'm transforming that quote for the Talmud. Any Talmud scholars out there want to take me on, and that'd be fun. But that there is a foundation, that maybe there's a way that I can address something that's beyond myself to help me deal with that pain and be present here. God, be present with me and help me be present with this pain.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to end with a reflection by Maxine, which I think is lovely. I haven't heard anyone talk about Feldenkrais's life path through so much upheaval and yet live his unavowed dreams. As the spiritual, haven't heard anyone talk about that, as this ultimate spiritual journey and as a model for what we are all living through right now. All that is absolutely woven into the method, and it meant he had to face fears and come to love himself, warts and all. Thank you, Maxine.
Thank you, Maxine.
I think a very beautiful place for us to end. Yes. I want to thank you, Maggie, for
thank you.
Just a joy, and Josh, a joy. I didn't know you all at all. I feel like now I have a little sense of you, and if we get to see each other at a conference or something, I'll be ready to sit down and
it would be lovely.
Sit close to you and sidle up close to you and have a little conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure and a real joy.
And you can find their websites and get in touch with them through their websites. So when you back out of the Zoom session, or if you're watching this on streaming or replay, the links are down below you that say Maggie's website, Josh's website. Someone asked earlier about how to contact them. We'll also have contacts on their websites. Wow, folks, thank you for hanging in there with me. We got one more night to go, and I'm excited to do it with you. So I'll be back tomorrow night. I hope most of you will join me again tomorrow night. And of course, don't forget, we have a bonus day, a bonus day.
So exciting.
Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you. For all the Yids out there, Shavua Tov. Have a good week.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.